I'm a single man in my early 30s. I've got a brother who's 29, and he's already got 4 kids now. He had his first at 22, and the second followed a year later, then the third 2 years after that. The most recent addition to the family, Mycel, arrived just a couple of months ago. I have to admit, I don't always see eye to eye with her. She has this way of acting superior, and I love how she can rile me up. She's a bit of a drama queen when I try to retaliate, but she's also the most compassionate person I know. My parents and brother are head over heels for her, and they know exactly how she really is, but they don't care. She's got a great smile, I'll give her that. But I have to admit, she can be a bit of a handful. She's also been looking for a job, but hasn't found one yet, even though she has a college degree. My mother is a dedicated and loving parent who dedicates most of her day to taking care of the kids. Their finances are entirely dependent on my brother, which is a great opportunity for him to be a hands-on parent. This means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. While it might be a bit tricky with so many people under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that's a few decades old, it's all part of the adventure. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, and he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way. It was evident that my parents showered him with extra love and attention, and he got the biggest share of everything. Other family members occasionally pointed out the imbalance.
This is your story channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please join us to stay updated with more real stories happening around you.
Other family members occasionally pointed out the imbalance, which led to my parents moving us about 150 miles away to create a more balanced environment. This meant that we only got to see them during holidays, but those holidays were always filled with fun and excitement. My brother had a great time flirting with my first girlfriend, and he had a good laugh at any little mishap I might have had. My parents were always so supportive, encouraging me to keep my chin up and keep moving forward. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I have to admit, it was a riot to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me as equals on birthdays and Christmas, in front of other people. We had some relatives who were very nosy and loved a good gossip. My parents did their best to keep things under wraps and even threatened to take my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. It was a bit of a laugh, to be honest. When I turned 18 and moved out, it meant my parents didn't have to provide for me anymore, and they celebrated by treating me like a grown-up. I was still in high school when I moved out, and I'm so glad I had the chance to make my own way. I was over the moon to be living on my own, and I loved spending time with my friends. I was on and off with them since I left, and I'm happy to say that I'm doing great. They didn't make it to my high school graduation, but that was okay because I was excited to start a new chapter in my life. But from that point on, I was set free. I still got to see my parents and brother on holidays, just like the rest of the family. The beginning of 2020 was a little challenging, but I took it one day at a time. I lost my job, and unfortunately, I couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job. We were both going through a rough time financially, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I absolutely adored. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I learned a valuable lesson. Next time, I'm renting a place that's more within my budget. I really enjoyed the luxury, but life had other plans. I realized that I should have been living somewhere far cheaper so I could have saved more money to fall back on. I had a plan, and I was excited to put it into action. I've always had a passion for trucks, so I bought a truck simply because I've always loved trucks. I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck just so I could live out of it for a while. At first, it was just a temporary adventure, but I ended up enjoying it so much that I ended up living out of it for a lot longer than I had anticipated. I was able to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still live. When I asked my parents if I could stay for a while, they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. We haven't always seen eye to eye over the past decade, but that's okay. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it had cost to rent an apartment in my area, which was way too much just to park my camper. I was out of work at the time, but I was determined to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I could have just as easily been living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents jokingly called my camper an eyesore and suggested I take a hike since we couldn't reach an agreement. And my sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious. I had to live in a camper, but I was excited to see what the next chapter would bring. My brother joined in the fun, pointing and laughing at me while calling me a homeless bum. I decided to take the plunge and park my truck camper in a store parking lot for the first night. I felt a bit anxious, as you might expect, thinking about the possibility of someone trying to break in. I had a great night's sleep, even if I did toss and turn a bit. There was nowhere else I could go, as any other relatives that own houses were fairly far away and all my friends were apartment dwellers. I was pretty attached to my area as well. I wasn't eager to leave, but I was open to the possibilities. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was super convenient. It was the only way I could still get my mail. I was determined to find a stable place to park, and I'm happy to report that I did. I started looking for a job that would be similar to my old one. After months of living the nomadic camp life, I was ready for a change. During that time, I met all kinds of people, from those in need to those with different opinions about my camper. At one point, someone told me to move, and they claimed to be with an HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, so that was a bit of a surprise. When I asked about this HOA, they became a bit agitated and even threatened me. I decided it would be best to move my camper, just to avoid any potential trouble. I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I realize it's not the best solution, but it's essential to keep my refrigerator cold. I had a small solar power bag for recharging my phone, but I didn't have a generator. Generators can be noisy and require fuel, but I was determined to find a solution. After months of living on my wits, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to relocate to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail, but that's all part of the adventure. I had a blast working retail back in college, and I promised myself I'd never go back to that, but I was almost ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. I was eager to explore new opportunities and experiences. I had a few things to do, like watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. I really admire the Japanese public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the backlit of the building by the warehouse and old employees. The employee parking spots were tucked away in the back, and no one seemed to use them because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My wonderful boss, who is also the company owner, really appreciated this flexibility because I was always willing to take on any shift, as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not entirely sure if this was allowed, but no one seemed to care. During my whole time there, I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, which was a huge relief. There were a few, but the security guards were on top of it and got them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and I was working virtually every day of the week. My awesome boss was so kind. He let me plug my camper into the building for power and water. I was able to pay a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when the office was mostly empty, except for the janitor and security guard. I was able to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, which was really convenient. The camper was equipped with a portable toilet, so I didn't have to worry about that. I made sure to use the other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse, which was awesome because I could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I even got to know the night security guard by first name. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was a breeze to heat up in the winter with its little electric heater. Summers were a different story, but that's a whole other adventure. It didn't have air conditioning, but I found a great deal on a used portable air conditioner, and that made a world of difference. I made some extra money from overtime and learned some new skills from the other employees. By midway through the year, I had an even better position in the company as a supervisor and a salary that was even better than my old job. That's when I decided it was time for a new adventure and bought a house. The scare I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I started looking for something close to my work, and I was thrilled to find a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles away. I negotiated the price down to $10,000 less than the asking price. With a down payment made up of my savings, I was able to secure a home loan. I was so excited to leave the camper behind and have a place of my own. There was plenty of space to back my truck in behind the house and set up the camper in the backyard. I put it there as its own little building, just in case I want to use it again. Once I was fully settled in the house, I couldn't resist sharing the news on Facebook. When my family saw the post, that's when the real fun began. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address. I'm still amazed that they found me, though. I was so surprised that they found me, and I was really touched that they wanted to come visit. I can't help but wonder if maybe they followed me at work or something. It would be so funny if that's what happened. When I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists, and then just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and one of them had this creepy smirk that she kept flashing me. It wasn't until later that I figured out why. It made me feel like a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were always talking about how I've got so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. I told them, sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept commenting on how there was more space than in our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job, too. I just knew it was a sign. Eventually, my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's when I realized they'd planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for now, said the house was too much for me alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with their 4th child. He said that my house is much closer to his job, which was really considerate of him. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they lived in the main house. I was delighted by the idea of living in a camper while they lived in the main house. Best of all, Dan never once mentioned asking for rent. And he's got a good job, too. He even started talking about how there would be some fun changes, like curfews, and that I'd need to give a little heads up before coming over. If it weren't for the brother, I would have thought the person I was talking to had lost their mind. Dan's perspective has changed over time, influenced by our parents' overprotective approach. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. I'm not about to rent my house or any part of my house to him. No way. I'd be open to renting out my house to other people, though, just to make paying the mortgage a bit easier. But certainly not him or his wife. I've seen this kind of situation in videos online, and I never thought I'd live it because I thought it was so silly. But you know what? My parents, brother, and Sildu all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So, I picked up my phone, set it to record, and held it close to my chest. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this, just sitting there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then, he suddenly started acting like it was already decided, and reached out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally felt it was the right moment to speak up and let him know I wasn't so sure about that. I said it loudly enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I don't usually raise my voice, because our parents always punished me when I did. But this was my house and I was in charge. I felt like my backbone was as shiny as could be. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs. I let him know that just because they wanted him to move in doesn't mean it'll happen. I bought my house for myself, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me, and said that I didn't deserve the house and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed and told him that I worked hard to buy my house, and I deserved it. I told him I totally deserved it. Dan started yelling about how I have no wife or kids, and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I let him know that I wasn't giving him anything. He never even offered to pay me rent, which I thought was a pretty generous offer. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan said that his family is his top priority and he shouldn't have to pay rent. Our parents said I was going to do this, and I will. I yelled as if their word was law or something and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then, my parents wrote 1Q, my parents, and Sold barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of back and forth, but to sum it up, from this point on, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," way more times than I can remember in the fight. I told them they couldn't decide for me, and I asked them to please leave. I said I would call the police if they didn't. Still, she screamed the loudest about how she was pregnant again and I can't do this to her. I told her I had done nothing to her. She just assumed she could take and take from me. I assured her that I would never do that. I made it clear that I didn't owe her or her family anything. I even called her a stuck-up. I told her I didn't think she had shown me much respect. I'm not concerned about what she thinks or how many kids she has. I'm not going to feel sorry for her. I'm not sure how we'll work out the details, but I'm not going to feel sorry for her. Her reaction made her angry enough to attack me, but I'm just glad I'm not living with her. She did give my face one solid hit, but my brother intervened, putting an end to the action. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out, but he didn't give in. The whole incident was caught on video by the phone I was holding. So I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving, and I was so happy. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I let her know that wasn't going to happen, and I asked her not to come back. I also let my sister-in-law know that my phone recorded everything, and if she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, loudly crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door, saying that I'd better do this for Dan and Mycel. I let her know that I won't be. As I said before, some people might find this hard to believe, but I'm ready to move on. I'm well aware that there are similar sounding posts online already. I've seen quite a few of them now, but it's not like those other people haven't been through similar things too. I'm kind of amazed this site hasn't been better weaponized against this sort of thing. If people who feel entitled were more afraid of getting out at here, we'd see a different outcome. I understand that feeling, and I don't blame anyone who calls. I would do the same if I were in their situation. If you read my first post, you'll get a sense of the unique challenges my parents have faced in raising me. They're the reason my brother turned out the way he did. I wonder if they've shared their perspective on my growth and development. I'm really excited to find out what that reason is. Some people don't have an answer for why they make certain choices, like favoring one child over another. My parents' instinct is to stand by the child they've backed, and that's exactly what they do. I've had a tough time with this, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to make it up to them. It's not about legal rights or wrongs, but more about the emotional impact. I'm a little upset with my parents, brother, and sister-in-law because they're trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother. I immediately went to my social media and told the whole family about it. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago. I also decided to put my profile on private. I decided to post about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home is try to twist the event to make me the villain. And boy, was I right. I had about an hour to get started before they did, and I made the most of it. I had video evidence to back up my story about what they've done. I'm not planning on sharing the video here, though, so don't even ask. I was able to get a fair number of family members on my side right away because I was proactive. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law were ready to write their own post, but they ended up not needing to. They didn't really need to lie much, so they didn't. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law had a few people supporting them, but not a ton. Many others were already aware of their entitled attitude. The result was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular who called me. I'm not sure who they were, but they called to say that I was a horrible brother and that I needed to make way for a real family man. I ended the call and blocked the number, and that was that. Thankfully, it didn't happen again, and I'm glad it didn't. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell nonstop and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened the door a little bit, and they tried to shove their way in again. I had installed latch chains to prevent them from shoving their way in, and I braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother were determined to enter, but I stood my ground. I let them know that I was documenting the whole thing on camera and that I'd call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother intervened, calming them down, and then in her most charming, dulcet tone, she inquired if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them that I'd be happy to let them move in, but that they could never come back. My mother then began to express her feelings, asking me why I couldn't just do this for Dan, since he's my beloved brother. I laughed and said, I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like that for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They're not the best parents, and he's a bit of a rough brother. I let them know that if they didn't leave, I would call the police. I was surprised, but they all left relatively quickly, except for my mother, who was in a bit of a crying spell, and the others who gave me some not-so-subtle looks. It was surprising how easily they left, but I guess that's what happens when you make an unwelcome guest leave. I thought the whole ordeal was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. Later that week, I came home on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family. They were moving in. He gave me a big grin and a wave when he saw me. I was a little surprised, but I let him know that the rest of his family could wait. He gave me a playful smile and said, "Like it or not, we're moving in." She even tilted her head and puckered her lips in the cutest way, saying that it was all good because my mom had given it the green light. She always says that I should listen to her, and I love her for it. I felt a surge of energy, and my face felt hot with anger as I looked at her. I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, saying that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. She even cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I replied, "Dan, it's my house, not his." She even threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, but I didn't back down. The 911 operator heard all of this thanks to the window being slightly open. I let Silas know that she had damaged my truck and that I was thinking about taking legal action. She was smart enough to retreat at that point. When the police arrived, Dan and Mycel, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I was so excited to tell the cops what had happened and show them my new driver's license with my current address on it. But when we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock and the old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was right next to it, and it was a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. I couldn't believe it. I showed them the broken lock and the drill, and then I explained everything that had happened. I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home, because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately started lying, saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I told them that wasn't the case, and it was easy to prove. Eventually, Dan and my sister-in-law came out of my house with some papers. They looked pretty pleased with themselves, like they'd outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I'm pretty sure they've never actually seen my signature. It was a pretty bold move on their part, but I'm glad I caught it. I shared this with my parents and Dan, and we all agreed that it was a pretty obvious fraud. If the cops investigated, they'd easily figure it out. I'm sure they'd be able to figure it out in court, and it'd be great to see them get their just desserts. It could even result in Dan losing his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said that I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. And I'd call CPS too just to be extra careful. When I said all that, Dan went white and looked really scared. But my mother jumped in, doubling down on the idea that I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I told her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she should do it for Dan herself and let him have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right away or I'd press charges. I explained that they had drilled out my front door lock to break in, and the papers were obviously fakes. They had forged my signature, and I was thrilled to see that they had done such a good job. I even recorded videos of the attack. I know that's a serious offense, but I was so excited about it. I could over their lives with if I wanted. If they don't leave, I'll do exactly what I'm planning. I've been waiting for the right moment and the opportunity to do what's best for the dance kids, giving them a chance to get out. As soon as my parents heard about it, I think they finally understood that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered, saying she'd put an end to this. She then went over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. But then Sil started crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits, tossing them like confetti. An officer told them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Meanwhile, Dan was enthusiastically encouraging his kids to help load their things back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room. Now, Mycel and Dan gathered their kids to try one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with a sad family routine. It was a heartwarming scene, with everyone gathering together in a tight group hug, facing one direction with a sense of unity and togetherness. I couldn't help but notice they'd probably practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had that same pleading look with quivering mouths. Mycel kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. My brother, with a face that said it all, implored, "Please, don't do this. We need to be able to live here." I didn't waver, though, and kept going, telling them to keep packing all the kids and crank up the crying to 11. Dan playfully chimed in with, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I burst out laughing, responding that he was trying to take, not share. I told him that no amount of crime would make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me. Felt like déjà vu, reminiscent of our childhood days. I couldn't help but laugh again as I remembered how he used to bomb me back then, until the cops told him to stop or he'd be in trouble. He paused, then looked at me, with a curious mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left. They promised they wouldn't leave until everything was sorted out. In the next few minutes, the number of cops increased from 2 to 4, as more arrived to assist. For some reason, this made my parents want to get moving. I asked Dan for the keys to the new lock he'd installed on my front door. I got another lock the next day anyway, because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was hesitant to hand them over, but I managed to convince him. Instead of handing them to me, he playfully tossed them down the street into a storm drain, saying I could go get them myself. One of the cops teased him a little for that, and he kindly went and got them for me. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them. It was quite the adventure. When he finally got the keys back, he just grumbled and slammed them down into my hand. I then enthusiastically told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, but I didn't care. I let them know that I was aware of their feelings. I added a playful touch of sarcasm, saying, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys where I always get treated like by you all anyway, because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. I joked that you treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So, I said, do what you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and suck it up." My parents were amazed when I shared all of this with them. The 4 cops listening to us were pretty judgmental too. I'd say that if you ever want to confront your parents about something, especially if they're not the easiest people to talk to, it's probably a good idea to do it in front of the cops. Chances are they won't try anything too crazy. My mother started crying and walking away, which was a first for her. My father just stood there, looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and Mycel was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. But before long, they all joined forces, helping each other pack up their things and loading them into boxes. Since we hadn't unpacked yet, everything went out pretty quickly. My mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan. She tried to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She even offered to pay me rent if I let them stay, which was really generous of her. When that didn't work, she suggested that I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I gently let her know that I'm not looking for Dan or his family around, and she should keep packing boxes. I'm not interested in his money. I'm not interested in living with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. I'm not interested in making a deal with my parents. After I said this, my sister-in-law had another tantrum. She threw a box down and sat on the ground, wanting to be consoled because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat there looking a little angry and sad until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. Before they left, I had a heart-to-heart with my parents about some of the challenges I faced growing up. With 4 cops right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it. It was a rare moment of peace. I had so much to share about all the things that had happened. I even told them how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet, or how they let Dan and so ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now, right? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it for free. But when I needed a place to stay, they wanted to charge me more than I could afford just to park my camper, even though they knew I was out of work. The cops were really impressed with my story, and they were amazed by how I handled it all. I asked my parents, "What did I do to deserve such treatment, other than being born to you?" When I finally experienced a bit of success in life, they seemed to want to take that away from me, preferring to give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again because clearly I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I asked them for answers, but I didn't receive any. They seemed a bit surprised, but that's okay. I kept going, asking what made them think they were such good parents. My father felt a bit embarrassed, but he took it well. My mother was in tears, expressing her belief that she was a horrible person. I totally understand where she's coming from. They all are. I'm positive they'll find their way. They were not the best people, and they were all aware of it. If I had confronted them about it in private, they would have gotten mad at me and just kept acting like I was in the wrong. They've been in denial for so long. It's become part of who they are. My mother was so sad. She buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked so sad and defeated. Dan and his family were busy putting everything back in the moving truck, so they didn't have much time for socializing. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They jumped back into their vehicles, and my sister-in-law just stood there staring at me with a playful glint in her eye. My brother finally convinced her to drive the minivan home, and we all headed back to our new place. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online and spilled the beans. What happened, you ask? My parents were a bit embarrassed, but they didn't want to defend their actions. While the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. It was really heartwarming to see how many people in the family came around to support me, and even those who hadn't before, well, they just didn't feel the need to take sides anymore. We did it for Dan Line, and now everyone's listening. So any remaining familial support they had is now gone. I was so happy to see that many in the family who I thought wouldn't support me did. Even the former flying monkeys are on board. Seems they've had enough, and I'm thrilled about that. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at Christmas Eve in my new house, and they accepted. My parents weren't invited, but that's okay. I was so happy to see that I wasn't blocked on my brother and Sil's profile. I was so excited to see that my sister-in-law had her 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents, which is great. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because they kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she could still guilt me. My parents must be thrilled to have their space again after dealing with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable Sil, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Maybe they should try something new and move into a camper in their own backyard. That way, Dan could take over their house completely. They'd probably get some peace then. I'm sure they'd be delighted to give Dan that space. There was supposed to be more, but this post got way too long. I'm excited to share part 3 later on. Here is some recent update. I was trying to keep things to 2 posts, but I realized while compiling everything that part 2 was just too long. I've split it into a part 3 for those who commented en masse to get cameras, and I'll be getting them when I can afford it. I'm still in the process of financially recovering from buying a house last year, but I'm excited about the future. I'm really looking forward to getting a good camera, but I also understand that a decent computer is essential for recording. My current laptop is a few years old and runs Windows 10, but I'm excited to upgrade soon. I'm definitely keeping an eye out for doorbell cameras. That would be my first one. I want to be clear about something for those of you who suggested that I should have just gotten my brother and so arrested. The only reason I didn't was because they are parents. Their kids need them, and if Dan was arrested, he'd likely lose his job. Without that, his family doesn't have any money, and his sister-in-law has a 1-month-old baby. Right now, neither of them needs to end up in jail. But we all know that you don't need jail for revenge. The police are there to help. I'm not looking for revenge, but I did get my own justice without going to the police. Would I be this merciful again? It's likely they understand this. I've decided to wait a little bit before making an account and posting, just in case anything else comes up. And wouldn't you know it? As some of you may recall, my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were clearly directed at me, especially after Mycel had her 4th baby in November. She posted the same repetitive nonsense over and over again. She found semi-clever ways of rewarding it, but she pretty much kept regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there isn't enough space, she needs her own house, and so on. I know it might sound like I'm dismissing the situation, but I can assure you that I'm not. If you were to witness the challenges I face with my in-laws, you might find yourself, too, ready to join in the sarcasm. They're a one-of-a-kind group, to say the least. And since I waited until January to make an account, more happened, just like I thought. I mentioned before that I invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house. Everyone I invited came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. They wanted to come and show me their support, and it was so heartwarming to see their commitment. I was showered with praise for my efforts in achieving independence and owning a home, and they expressed their sympathy for all that I'd been through. One person even asked me why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them, since I hadn't had a home for so long. I admitted, a bit sheepishly, that I was very attached to living around here and that I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have many great job opportunities in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to make my own way as much as I could. They seemed to understand, and it was a great conversation. We ended up having a really nice party, the best I'd been to in years. Some of my relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, which added to the festive atmosphere. I was over the moon when my uncle brought a CD of Ray Charles's Christmas songs. It was my favorite. His unique style and talent for Christmas songs is truly unmatched. It was such a grand and happy time. It was a moment when I felt like I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. After about 2 hours, something truly amazing happened. My parents and brother showed up, looking radiant and happy to be there. They didn't even knock. They just walked right in my front door as if they were meant to be there. I switched off the music and asked them to leave right away. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles jumped up and started yelling at them, so I didn't get another chance to speak. He said, "They don't deserve to be in my home or my life after what they tried to do months earlier." Several other relatives agreed with him. This guy is my mother's brother, and he used to be head over heels for her. But then he found out about the things that went on between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mother's parents, though advanced in age, jumped in and said to my parents, "If you want to make amends with me, it's a bit too soon." They've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They had kept their favoritism for my brother hidden for a long time. But no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to try and actually treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. They turned to Dan and Mycel and said they'd seen the repetitive nonsense Mycel kept posting about. They're ready for a change and want to move on. They're ready for a change and want to move on. My house won't be their new home. Mycel went back to her usual routine of a little crying and a pity party, but I'm staying positive. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say it wasn't fair. I've got this house all to myself, and she has 4 kids who need more space. She just wanted a better place to live and feel like a real mom. I know it was petty of me, but I couldn't help but point out that she could probably do better as a mother. After all, she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her butt all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money. I couldn't help but laugh when she complained about it. I even joke that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her milk since she drinks so much booze. I do have to admit that I go a bit too far sometimes. Like when I got some stares and Mycel demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I told her that the evidence speaks for itself. If she's looking to leave my parents' house one day, she should definitely put her college degree to good use. Having a job and some savings would be a great start. My mother is an amazing support system for my brother's kids, and she'll be able to dedicate more time to childcare once her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest child, who is 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He even told me that his mom said I was the bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. At that point, my brother intervened, gently but firmly, pulling his son away. The other relatives jumped back in, and this spirited interaction turned into a lively family intervention. She was in tears. Her new baby was also crying. Her kids were crying. Even Dan was almost moved to tears by the passionate words he was hearing. In the end, he found himself sitting on the ottoman by the front door, feeling overwhelmed. He felt like a complete mess, unable to look anyone in the eye. He was overwhelmed, and it was hard for him to find the words to say more than a few words to me. It was a thrilling moment, especially since the whole house was filled with people eager to see him in his element. If they hadn't been there, I'm sure it would have ended up like when he tried to order me around to take my house months earlier. But this time, he'd been so embarrassed that it had really hurt his parents' reputation in the family. After my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left, the party continued, and we all chose to focus on the fun and forget about the incident for the rest of the evening, especially since most of the adults had been enjoying a few drinks. Everyone stayed the night in my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper so there'd be enough space. I have to admit, it's also a great guest house. Earlier, my relatives had asked to take a tour of it, and they were amazed that I've been living in it for around 2 years. I got to answer all kinds of questions like what it was like in the summer and winter and so on. I was up with the chickens Christmas morning, ready to greet my guests with a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those inevitable eggnog hangovers. I was so pleased to hear that I was considered a way nicer host than my parents ever were. Everyone agreed that it was such a success that we should all do it again next Christmas. After Christmas, my friend Mycel finally stopped posting obvious digs at me and deleted all of the old ones. But recently after the new year, she posted something new. She said she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did so it could be set up in the backyard. The idea was that Dan and his family could enjoy the entire house as their family home. However, my parents weren't quite on board with that idea. I don't think anyone's planning on pushing them out of their own home, especially not their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before my sister-in-law removed it, and she hasn't posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, can it still complain? I think she's come to realize that it's not really getting through to anyone anymore. And Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone anytime soon if they end up expecting another child in the next few years, which I wouldn't be surprised by. Things have calmed down for me since then, and I've even invited friends over for a poker night. I'm not the best at poker, but I love having friends over. But hey, it's all good. We get to drink beer and eat junk food while being merry. We all ordered supersized meals from Burger King and just had a blast. It's the perfect way for grown men to unwind and enjoy each other's company. I'm seriously considering embarking on a new romantic journey this summer, and I'm excited to see what happens. I'm not getting any younger, so I'm making the most of my time. Fingers crossed it goes well. My camper is just sitting idle in my yard now, but I'm excited to get it out and about again soon. I'll admit, There were days when I'd go out just to spend time in it. I lived in it for 2 years, and it was an incredible experience. It's like my second home. I'm so excited for its first camping trip. I've never been a camper before, but I'm excited to try it out soon. My parents used to think camping was a waste of time, but I'm determined to show them what it's all about. So, it'll be a completely new experience for me. This marks the end of what happened, and the beginning of a new adventure. My parents, brother, and Mycel have all been staying very clear of me, which I'm sure is for the best. They've gone back to acting like I don't exist, like they did before I bought a house. But I'm ready to move on. I'm not worried about it at all. It's just better this way. I'm positive that they'll be back in the fold eventually. I'm excited to see what they'll do next. If anything comes of all this that's worth mentioning, I'll be sure to make another post, as long as this account is still active. One more update. Some folks who left comments on my old posts might be a little surprised, but I'm happy to say that my parents did some of the exact things they said they would. They wanted either my money or my signature. I was expecting the usual spiel about how I owed them or some kind of socialist nonsense, but I'm happy I was wrong. They even brought up the idea of sharing the wealth, which is a pretty cool thought. But that was just my imagination running wild. The situation that ensued was somewhat similar, but much more tame. It seems like they've figured out that I've reached my limit. We're mostly aiming for pity, and it's going really well. It all started when my parents recently reached out to me on social media and asked to meet in a public place of my choosing. First, it felt a bit like something out of a movie, but I wasn't worried. In fact, I was amused. They know I'm not with anyone these days, so I was intrigued to see what they had in mind. This time, I picked a local restaurant that has a name that sounds like an olive in a garden, and we met up there. Dan was with them, but he mostly kept to himself. We had our share of awkward greetings, ordered drinks, and then got right to the heart of the matter. My parents were super excited about helping Dan get his own apartment so he could move out. Apparently, Dan's credit history has had its challenges. I'm curious to know the reason behind that. Could it be his wife's tendency to regularly spend him into a hole? They asked if I could help by providing some capital, co-signing for the apartment, and helping to pay the rent. I was so excited to help, but I politely said no to both offers. That's when Dan spoke up, and he was passionate. He said that I have so much and I don't have a family to support like he does. He asked me to consider saving some of my money for his family, since I don't have a family of my own. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. That's right. They were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood? I'd love to delve into that. With a warm smile and a gentle touch, my mother took my hand, asking me not to speak of it. My father and Dan both just looked away and said nothing. I'm pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to, but they held back. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something, and they just looked at me. When I told them I didn't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer in headlights. I tried to explain that I'd been saving up for a down payment on my house, and that I had to live and work to save that much money so quickly. I explained how I had saved so much, and then I spent nearly all of it on the down payment for my house. I'm still working on my finances, but I'm feeling so excited about my future. I did have some extra money each month, but most of it was going right into my savings. I asked Dan what his yearly salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I did some quick math in front of my parents, showing that about 70% of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gasoline, internet, phone, food, and other bills. I could put about 30% of that left at most into savings. I'm determined to save that money and get back on my feet in time. I'm determined to save up and be prepared for anything life throws my way. My truck is a 90s model, so it's definitely time for an upgrade. If it were to break down, I'd need money to either fix or replace it. And there are so many other things one would need a rainy day fund for, like home repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or anything in general you'd need quick cash for when it's a sudden unexpected expense. So, as you can imagine, I just can't spare money for Dan, and I also refused to co-sign for anything because I didn't want to be responsible for any bills Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. I mentioned that this is probably why my parents didn't co-sign for Dan's apartment themselves long ago. My mother started crying again, but I was happy for her. I was pretty much one step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not a fool. I let them know that I understood. I thought my dad would get mad at me like he usually does, but he didn't. But this time he didn't. I've known this man to get upset with me for the smallest things, like not enabling my brother all of my life. But this time he didn't. He didn't even look upset. Instead, his face showed a mix of regret and defeat. Could be a sense of regret for not being the best parent, or maybe he's realizing he can't bully me anymore. Who knows? Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't about to give them any money. Dan got up and said this was all just a waste of their time, and that he was leaving. My mother apologized for him, but he was determined to leave. Then, to top it off, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all there. I guess they couldn't turn down free food, since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks yet. And wouldn't you know it? They actually stayed. I made sure to steer the conversation away from money the whole time. Dan remained quiet, either eating his food or looking at his phone. My parents joined in the conversation, and it was a really nice moment. They told me about their newfound passion for a local Christian church, where they'd been going for the past 2 weeks. I said, good for them. And of course, they started trying to convince me to go with them. I graciously refused, expressing my sincere gratitude for their encouragement. They were smart enough not to push further. When the meal was over, Dan left a $10 tip on the table and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior, and we all parted ways. That was pretty much it. It wasn't as intense as some other situations I've been in, but it was a big step up from before. As for Sil, she's been voicing her concerns online about my parents, but she's come to realize that her role isn't as dominant as she thought. I think her toxicity is finally getting to them, and that's a positive change. It's so heartwarming to see them coming back to me. Sil actually wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to do in order to make space in the house, which I think is a really nice idea. She's had her fair share of rejections, but she's still hopeful. She's got a bunch of people who are all on the same page as her, and I get the occasional message from folks I don't even know. They're really invested in telling me to sell my house. I've learned to let these messages go, choosing not to engage in back and forth. I just block and move on. There was one persistent troll who had my phone number, and they call from a different number every time. It's the same person who called me to say I need to make way for a real family. But I'm not going to let that manly posturing shake my confidence. The calls have definitely slowed down, maybe even stopped, because I made it clear to that person that they were only amusing me by keeping this up so long. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month, and it's been quiet since then. 2 more update. I had planned to wait half a year or so after the original post to update everyone, but I'm happy to report that it ended up being even longer than that. Yes, things did go bad again, but not really for me. I'm doing great, almost unscathed since last Christmas, except for a few minor hiccups. One was when my parents and dad came to me for money, as I mentioned in my last post, and another was a recent little tiff with my sister-in-law. I did get a few cameras for my house, including a Ring doorbell in front. I kept the new gear a secret from my family, just to keep the fun going. I'm thrilled to share that, so far, no one has attempted a break-in. I think the way I added them all before really scared them off, and now they've mostly left me alone. I've also started renting out 2 of the rooms in my house, one to a close friend and the other to a friend of said close friend. I'm delighted to say that they've been the best tenants ever. They're such sweeties. They keep to themselves and let me be my own person most of the time. They even have small refrigerators in their rooms so they don't need to keep any of their drinks in the main fridge. I offered them an incredible deal on rent, and they couldn't have been happier. It's not just boosted my monthly income, but it's also been a huge help with covering my mortgage. I bet you're curious about how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law feel about me renting out the rooms to friends. Well, they're not too thrilled, but they've come around. My father and Dan were a bit surprised, but they've come around. In fact, my mother even came to me in tears, asking how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family. We had a lively discussion where I pointed out that they had broken into my house before and tried to steal it. She was understandably concerned about having someone who might do that again. Also, there wasn't enough room for me, Dan, and his entire family in my house. I'd never share a roof with him, but that's not the point. It's a 3-bedroom, manufactured home, and it's all mine. I have the master bedroom and its adjoining bathroom. That would have left only 2 small rooms for Dan, Sil, and 4 kids. I'm sure it would have been a bit of a tight fit, but I'm sure we could have worked it out. Also, she knows very well that I can't be around Sil because she intentionally antagonizes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless before. My current tenants are both single guys in their 30s, and they're great. I get along with them. My mother had a hard time with it, but she finally let it go and admitted she was just desperate. Edit. Parents found out I was renting rooms out because Mycel basically stopped me in some way. She then told my parents, who contacted me, and then my mother came over to talk about it. Since then, my parents haven't said a word to me about it. Things couldn't be better for me. My parents and Dan are navigating their own path, and they're doing it their own way. I had some concerns about Sil, but I was pleasantly surprised by how things turned out. I had a hunch that Sil was a bit of a drama queen. But wow! Did she go above and beyond? She really went all out, but in the end, the truth came out. As it turns out, Dan's youngest child isn't actually his. Yeah, you read that right. It seems that Dan had an affair, which, upon further reflection, isn't too shocking. Some of you saw this coming a few months ago. After being caught, he was kicked out of the family. Dan just recently finished his divorce, which actually went in his favor since we thankfully live in an at-fault state. He also sued to get his name taken off the birth certificate of the youngest child and won. After my parents tried to take my house, things got pretty rocky with them. Mycel blamed me, but I'm sure that will change soon. She thought I was rolling in money, like I'd won the lottery, and thought I should share the wealth. She thought it'd be a good idea for them to come to my Christmas party, hoping they could get on my good side. She also had the brilliant idea to have my parents and Dan try to get money from me for an apartment. So, it was a bit of a shock when Dan and my parents filled her in on the true state of my finances. Up until then, she had cast a spell over them, feeding their narcissism with her own. So when she blamed me, the rest of them followed suit. But then something incredible happened in front of the police when they tried to steal my house. That's when the challenges for Mycel truly began. My parents and Dan were a bit hesitant about attending my Christmas party after their outburst, but they eventually agreed to just gather a few affordable gifts at the last minute and show up, since he promised not to kick us out once we were there. Boy, was she wrong. She took a leap of faith and it paid off. I, with the full support of everyone I'd invited through her, decided to go ahead with the party. Her plan, which she thought was so clever, backfired spectacularly. I think being reprimanded by my family at the party was a wake-up call for them to stop listening to my sister-in-law. As I mentioned in my last post, my parents decided to go back to church, probably because I'd said they probably would. I can't say for certain that this is the reason, but wouldn't it be nice if that were the case? My parents hadn't been to church in 20 years before going back, and I'm excited to see what happens. I don't think it's a bad idea that they're going back to church, but I do think it's important to understand that going doesn't just give them a do-over for all the things they've done in the past. I'm hopeful that they'll try, and I appreciate that they came to my house without Dan to apologize in person after watching an animated video of my first 3 posts. That's really something. They've had the chance to see this Reddit account for quite some time. They're in the loop with everything I'm sharing. Yes, they're unhappy about it, but I feel everyone here deserves an update since it's anonymous. For my parents and Dan, seeing the video of themselves and their actions was a great way to understand the kind of people they really are. They even came over to apologize to me later. It was a heartwarming moment, especially since it was a rare occurrence for my dad to apologize like that. And the man isn't a good actor. It felt so genuine. They fully acknowledged what they did to me and how there's no excuse for any of it. They even described themselves as narcissists and admitted the truth that they had wronged me very badly. Then they went on to blame Mycel for a lot of things. They did kind of throw her under the bus. But it's true that she was guilty of everything they said. My parents have been getting counseling for a while now, and it offers group family counseling, but I decided to wait a little longer since I'm not quite ready for that right now. Dan took some time to apologize, and he's been showing a lot of remorse whenever the past is brought up. Dan and his wife's marriage has also faced challenges. It wasn't a gradual disintegration. It was a swift and dramatic shift. I was the one left holding the bag, and they couldn't ridicule or take advantage of me anymore. After the public humiliation of social media, my Reddit posts, and the animated online video, Mycel finally let out enough of her toxic on Dan and my parents for them to realize she's not the person they thought she was. Their initial denial was understandable, but Mycel's sense of entitlement was stronger. I couldn't help but think of lightsabers clashing over this drama. Mycel was dressed like a bimbo Sith with a lightsaber that looked like a giant lipstick or something like that. It's hard not to picture all the funny jokes and puns that could be made, but I'll leave the best ones for you to imagine. But, as you can imagine, things only got worse because Mycel kept looking for other ways to get what she wanted. She kept bringing up ads for used campers and RVs, trying to get my parents to buy one so they could live out of it and have the main house. But no matter how many times they told her to stop, she just kept going. She even joked about my parents just buying an RV and living out their retirement years on the road, like normal old folks do. That was a bold idea, even for Mycel. My parents suggested that Dan and Mycel buy a camp for themselves to live out of it. But, to my surprise, Mycel boldly declared that she shouldn't have to do that since she's the mom. She even joked about how she thought she had total parental authority over everyone because the kids in the house were all hers. When Mycel didn't get away, she actually took her baby and left the house to disappear for several days. They were confident she was doing well because her phone was still working, and she was responding to texts with short, passive-aggressive answers. When she came back, she was more embittered than ever because nobody gave in to her demands while she was away. On top of that, she decided to skip church, which was a new twist. Dan went with our parents, bringing his kids along for the adventure, except for the youngest, since Mycel wasn't quite on board with that idea. I, for one, don't go to church. I believe in God and all that, but I just don't like church. It just wasn't my cup of tea growing up. 3 more update. I'm thrilled to share that much of this information came from Dan and my parents. I'm just sharing what I know. Things really heated up when Dan suddenly called out his wife as a cheater. It was a really shocking revelation, especially since we all thought he was her biggest supporter. But no, he's not, at least not anymore. You all know how he treated me when I was on his bad side. Well, his wife wasn't spared that. I heard it all. He started suspecting things about her after he finally started thinking clearly, and he got DNA tests for all his kids. 3 of his kids are his, but the youngest one, the baby, wasn't. For the record, Dan and I both have dark straight hair that's almost black. Our parents have similar hair, which is a beautiful family trait. Mycel's hair is straight and pretty dark, too, but the baby's hair is lighter and a bit curly. At first, and thought it was just because of the baby's age, but that was just the beginning. Mycel kept playing it off and said that it would darken in time, but the baby's hair never got darker. I guess that was Dan's biggest clue. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in front of our parents, and she broke down sobbing that it was a mistake. Mycel really went to bat, denying, trickling, truthing, and gaslighting, but it was all in the name of love. But Dan had a lot of insight into the situation, and he had done more to find out about her affair than I would have ever thought. I knew he was smart. He just let himself be done. He had the phone records that showed her affair. Taxi got off her phone, bank records, and the DNA test. He even identified the man she's cheating with, who is likely the father since he is much lighter colored and has curly hair. The evidence against her was crystal clear. Dan said she didn't even try to hide her affair, and he figured it all out easily. Once he started looking, my parents were thrilled and demanded that she leave their house immediately. That's when she went on them all. She started with yelling, but quickly escalated to physical violence. My mother called the police, and, sure enough, the Mycel was arrested. She scratched up Dan and my father quite a bit with her long fake nails. She even got her eldest kid involved when she hit him hard enough to give him a black eye and a nosebleed when he tried to intervene. Thankfully, Dan was smart enough to have his phone recording nearby when he confronted her. This allowed the police to easily arrest her for assault. The Mycel's parents had to drive over to bail her out. Then they came back for the baby, Mycel stuff, and her car as well. A couple days after Mycel got bailed out, She showed up at my house because, it seemed, I was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she started ranting about how I was posting on Reddit and how I was the reason she was even alive. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been high on something because this felt a little out there for her, and her eyes didn't look right. She said that mothers with young children are the most sacred thing in the world. Then she started yelling about how giving up my house shouldn't have been too much to ask for because supporting the family was the least I could have done. She said that if I had done that, her family would still be together. When I tried to talk while she was speaking, she actually attempted to shove me and cover my mouth. She even had her hand poised like she was ready to scratch me. Well, that went about as well with me as you can expect. I'm not one to be threatened, so I told her I'd call the police if she didn't take her hands off me right away. I also let her know that I had footage of the incident on my doorbell camera. She started panicking the moment she heard the camera. I let her know I was there, and she backed off. I let her know that I thought it was a bit unfair for her to call me entitled when she was the one who had done the entitlement. She didn't work for anything she had anymore. She cheated on her husband and got pregnant from her affair partner. She made my mother do most of the parenting for her children, spent Dan's money until they were in a financial hole, and acted entitled to my home to the point of trying to steal it. I let her know that I thought she was acting entitled and that her actions were a result of her narcissism. I gently suggested that she stop blaming me for her actions and asked that she please refrain from visiting my home. After a lively exchange, I hightailed it out of there, ready to move on to greener pastures. This was the last straw for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report on her for harassment and the assault she'd done on me last year. The fact that she put her hands on me at my front porch only added to it. The police have everything on record now. I even gave copies of the video to Dan's divorce lawyer. I also filed for a restraining order against Mycel. The court granted it without hesitation, recognizing the serious nature of the allegations. I'm so glad to hear that she hasn't posted anything about me on social media since then. I'm sure she's just keeping her profile on private. I'm sure she's already started blaming others. Either way, she's left me alone, which is great. Mycel was still with her affair partner during the divorce, but that's water under the bridge. I had no idea what kind of man he was at the time. I'm sure he's a great guy. Once the divorce was underway, though, Mycel admitted that Dan just wasn't man enough for her anymore because he couldn't afford to give her the lifestyle she wanted. She saw herself as a trophy wife and felt that her relationship should be with someone wealthy. Dan pulled Amy and maniacally laughed at her. He said she wasn't hot enough to be a trophy wife and mentioned any other faults she had. This led to a playful showdown where Amy ran off, much like a child. Because she was living with her parents, she was able to gain first-hand experience in the family business. She had already maxed out all the credit cards he had given her, and she complained about having to work for her parents, even though she had a college degree. I'm sure they were the only ones who'd employ her anyway, since she's got a criminal record and a decade-long gap in her resume. I heard from Dan that her parents were disappointed in her, but I'm not sure where that came from. They might be just as bad as her, but I'm excited to find out. The divorce really took off once it got going, and that was exciting. Mycel didn't walk away with much from it, especially because she had an affair, physically hurt her husband and eldest child. And it's an at-fault state like I mentioned earlier. So, it seems like she might have lost any chance of getting her way. I'll be sharing all the juicy details in the final post. For more update, this is what I know of the divorce from my brother Dan. Dan's lawyer was great and got the divorce started right away, but it cost him. I'm so excited to share all the nitty-gritty details and the total cost in the final post. They never spilled the beans, but I'm excited to share all the juicy details in my upcoming post. On the other hand, he was in a tough spot financially. You know how it is when you corner an animal. She put up a fight, but the law wasn't on her side, and her dwindling finances made it difficult. Thankfully, her Mycel's parents were kind enough to cover her legal expenses, and the lawyer they hired was really skilled. She even brought her affair partner to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was quite the character. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile that he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed that Sal had been wronged by an incompetent husband, which is why she sought the arms of another man. He said he was ready to take responsibility for his child with Sil, but that Sil would still need alimony to help support herself and care for the child. He even joked that because Dan was still on the birth certificate, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan said this guy used big words and a charming smile, but seemed an extra special kind of stupid. And we all know that coming from Dan is saying something, but the judge wasn't having it. He told Dan in no uncertain terms that he was a hypocrite for saying he was ready to take responsibility for his child, while also asking for money from the man whose marriage he had helped ruin. Dan was even prepared to sue his wife's affair partner for alienation of affection, but, as often happens, things didn't quite go as planned. It would have been up to Dan to show how much she'd loved him before the affair began. But after the truth came out, we're not so sure if she ever really loved him or just enjoyed having a meal ticket. Someone here mentioned that Sil might have been busy having kids to avoid getting a job. You might have been right either way, but it seems like Sil tried to drag out the divorce, although Dan's lawyer and the judge kept it from happening. I truly believe that Dan was incredibly fortunate to have a judge who was so tough on unfaithful spouses. All the evidence we had on Sil made it easy to keep her from playing the victim. Instead of keeping up the act, she just let her true self shine through, because there was no point in hiding it anymore. The court had all of the records provided by Dan and myself, police reports, photos, and recordings to prove she was an abusive narcissist. Sil faced an uphill battle, but we were confident in our strategy. She bravely fought against the mountain, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche in progress. In the end, we settled the divorce quickly and efficiently. Dan was so kind and understanding, he took on 3/4 of the credit card debt, agreed to have his name removed from the affair, and was thrilled to have his name on the baby's birth certificate. Sil walked away with partial custody of her children, no alimony, and the majority of the credit debts she had accumulated were discharged. Her parents' employment meant that she had an income of her own to fall back on and start paying off her debts. The best part? She gets to see her other kids whenever she wants, and she can take them on weekends. While it's true that she hasn't made many attempts to see them, she's still working on it. She's taken them out for fast food on occasion, but she's never taken them home with her. Now that the kids are back in school, she's got even less time to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's children before that either. It's possible they just don't feel the need to see them anymore. I'm curious. Do they have a different perspective on family life? Even Dan isn't sure. Dan says his in-laws were always indifferent to him, but that's not going to stop him from seeing his grandchildren. Dan really did love his wife, and that's what matters most. So, when he found out about her affair, it was a real eye-opener. Let's take a moment to rewind back to the night of his heart-to-heart with his wife. He came to me in a daze, a whiskey bottle in hand, his face scratched up and covered. I'm sure you can imagine how that went. I wouldn't say he was drunk, but he looked pretty scared when he came in. I told him off for driving under the influence, but that didn't really mean much to him compared to the betrayal of his cheating ex-wife. We spent a few hours in my camper, catching up and making sure my tenants weren't disturbed. During this time, Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and expressing his feelings about his marriage to Sil. Now, whenever he talks about her, he simply refers to her as that. So that's Excel's nickname. It's funny, but this time together was the most bonding Dan I've been in 15 years. While he didn't exactly apologize to me, he called himself a shitty human being with terrible taste in women, then said I at least didn't make his mistakes. Despite all he did to me in the past, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home. So I invited him to spend the night and managed to get his keys. I set up a cozy bunk in my camper for him, and we had a great time. I rented out my spare rooms. After all, he was in no shape to drive home. If he'd taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it and then come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that. I was a little worried he might do something crazy if I let him leave, but I figured it was best for everyone involved. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, and I knew that by putting him in the camper, he'd have his own space. So, I thought it would be really nice of me to offer him the camper. I'm sure he was a great guy, but just because he was there didn't mean I suddenly trusted him. It was better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We had a blast spending time in the camper, playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker was a bit of a challenge with just two of us, and an old maid was a bit dull. Luckily, I had an Uno deck and an old-school battleship game, too. He really seemed to enjoy those. Kept him busy until he finally decided to call it a night, probably after running out of whiskey. He did end up puking a lot, but he was game to sleep in my camper. He even thought it was pretty cool. Dan was curious about how I had managed to live in the camper for such a long time. I was happy to share my experiences with him, and he seemed intrigued. I was eager to get some rest, though, as I had to rise early the next day. I let him borrow my portable DVD player, which had a couple of movies on it. I thought that would keep him busy enough to stay awake before leaving for work in the morning. I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette. I also left his car keys and a note explaining that he could leave through the backyard gate. He was able to leave without any trouble around 1:30 p.m., about a month after Mycel, aka that, was kicked out. Then, Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I'd thought when he slept in it. He cheerfully admitted that he had been waiting to ask for it, out of pride. Now that his soon-to-be ex-wife has moved out, he's generously offered his eldest child the use of his room. He has 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest and now 8 years old. The kids were all forced to share a room, but now they can each have their own space. Up until that point, they had just curtains up for the boys' half of the room. The boy would often sleep on the couch to avoid his sisters, but now he can have his own room. I can only imagine how much he was longing for his own space. So I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper so his son could have his own room. If he could have afforded it, he would have bought his own camper instead of relying on me. He said as much, and I was so touched. I hadn't even had the chance to use the camper for camping yet, but I was happy to let him use it since it was for a good cause and he promised to buy his own in time anyway. I didn't even ask for rent money for the camper. Dan's financial situation is a bit tight right now, but I'm confident he'll get through it. The divorce was really tough on him. I found that I get better results with family these days by not being spiteful. I loaded up my camper and parked it in my parents' backyard, and my father even put in a 30-amp breaker so Dan can run heat in AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper after all that time living in it. It really felt like it was a part of me. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to lend it out to support the dance kids. I formed such a bond with the kids, and it's for them that I'm willing to do anything for my parents or Dan. I understand that it might not be back in my hands for a while, and it might not be in its original condition when it is, but that's all part of the adventure. I've made sure to let Dan and my parents know that they'll be responsible for any damage or upkeep while they have it. I've taken some before and after pictures and videos to show how great the camper is in condition, so they'll know exactly what they're getting. Dan even recorded a video with me, agreeing to my terms. It's basically a contract, and it's as good as it gets. With the financial challenges of divorce, Dan won't be able to get a place of his own for years. It's so great to see how much Dan is enjoying living in the camper. I'm not sure if he actually likes it or if he's just putting up a front, but either way, I'm happy for him. I can't help but think it reminds him of the backyard forts we had as kids, since that's how it felt with me sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now, and that's all that matters. I was so happy when the extended family praised me for letting him borrow it, too. It's heartwarming to hear many of them calling me the good brother. It makes my day. Dan doesn't deserve either way, but I'm thrilled to see him enjoying it. It's so wonderful to see our family strengthening our bond. I have to admit, I still have some reservations about my brother and parents after the way they treated me, but I'm working on it. I'm not going to let Dan's kids suffer because of it. I'm delighted to say that those kids have really warmed up to me. They're over the moon to see me whenever I come over or visit. I've even been lucky enough to babysit a few times, and I've noticed the positive change in their behavior, especially towards me. I'm having a blast being an uncle, and it's a wonderful feeling to see the bond forming. My mother is still doing the bulk of the parenting for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father, on the other hand, sometimes looks a bit defeated around me, but otherwise he's been either quiet or really nice. While he doesn't talk to me as much as I'd like, it's still a huge improvement from before. I'm doing my best to keep my guard up, but I'm also trying to be open to the possibility of new connections. Either way, I'm staying positive. My parents are genuinely happy that my Mycel is gone, and they often joke that they don't know what they ever saw in her, especially my mother. His mom has been here for a long time now, for the last part. At the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That didn't really want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan, as she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either, but I was thrilled to be wrong. But as it turned out, he was. Dan's lawyer had a long talk with Mycel's lawyer. Mycel didn't have a leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go to bat to make her situation even worse. She didn't have the financial resources to continue fighting him, and she agreed to change the birth certificate. The man who was the child's father took on financial responsibility, and they ended up not staying together. He reached out to Dan's lawyer to kindly let him know that he'd decided to call it quits and wouldn't be bothering him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan linked me to it, and the lout was upset that now he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have and that he's too young for this. Dan's lawyer found out that the man is just over 40, which is great because it means he's still got plenty of time to enjoy life and all that it has to offer. He looks younger than he is, but he's definitely not a young man. He put his online profile on private Mycel, which he had already done with hers a long time ago. I'm at the end of my information, but I'm so excited to see what happens next. This could be the end of the road for us. It's going to be great to not have Mycel in our hair anymore. My parents and brother have been working so hard to be better people, and it makes me so happy for them. I'm thrilled to be an uncle, and my house is still my house. 5 more update. No surprise here, but Mycel saw my Reddit post. I'm glad I was able to put a stop to any contact with my restraining order. She might not have the financial means to hire a lawyer right now, given the financial impact of the divorce. She's been talking to Dan about it, and she's been demanding that he tell me to delete my Reddit account. But not only has Dan read my recent posts, he no longer cares. He said they remind him of the prick he used to be, but he's not losing sleep over it. I've still helped him out despite all he's done to me, so there's really no reason for him to be upset. My parents have also been really kind and made sure to treat Dan and me equally, which is really sweet of them. My father, on the other hand, still doesn't say much around me. Someone mentioned that, after so long of treating me very differently from Dan, it might be hard for him to connect with me now. I think they're right. I don't mind his current demeanor, but my mother has picked up a habit of apologizing for everything in my presence. Dan told me that she and my father have been scolded by extended family and their counselor. Now, my mother feels like she needs to apologize for everything. This is such a change from how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't talk about before what Mycel's opinion was on Dan borrowing my camper so his son could have his and Mycel's old bedroom. She looked down on him and even joked about it, saying he was living like a bomb. But Dan, my sweet boy, took it all in stride. He even joked with her, asking if she was done yet because he knew this was exactly how she'd react. He's so self-assured that he just doesn't care anymore. He's so used to it all that her insults went in one ear and out the other. He pointed out that he was living out of the camper because he was putting his kids ahead of himself, wanting his son to have his own room, something his ex never did despite being their mother. He said that she used her children and pregnancy as weapons to avoid working and to emotionally blackmail everyone. With a playful smile, he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. This was early on in their divorce, and it was clear they were both open to new possibilities. I'm sure you can all guess her reaction. Dan mentioned that his ex was a bit upset about my recent posts, but no one's contacted me to take them down. So, she'll just have to deal with the consequences of her actions. She's been doing her best to win him back, but it's just not working out. It's like the grass isn't so green after all. Living with her parents, Dan puts up with her as the mother of his children whenever they meet, but that's it. He's made it clear that she won't be coming back into his life. He's told me that he can't look at her the way he used to, but that's okay. The mere thought of her is enough to send him into a state of emotional disarray. While it may not be easy, there's always hope for the future. I don't have any new information about his affair partner. His social media is still locked down, so I'm not sure what I'm missing there. The same goes for Mycel. As long as I have a chance to read them, I'm sure I'll be able to find out more. 6 more update. It happened in the middle of the night / very early morning on the 1st. I have a feeling it might have been my Mycel, but the person my cameras recorded was wearing layers of heavy sweats and had their face wrapped up, along with big glasses covering their eyes. It's hard to tell if they're a man or woman. They came on foot, so there's no way to tell if it was a man or woman. They did look about as tall as Mycel, which is a pretty solid piece of evidence. If it was Mycel, she knew about my cameras, so covering her face and body for petty, eggy revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. She really put her college degree to use by egging that beat-up old pickup truck. The egger showed up around 3 a.m., but I was sound asleep and didn't hear a thing. The culprit threw a dozen eggs or so at my truck, adding a touch of color to the night. Thankfully, they didn't cause any further damage and quickly left, leaving the truck all cleaned up. As soon as they finished, they were gone. I didn't see the mess until I was leaving for work in the morning. I hopped out of bed and took my truck to a local car wash during my lunch break. That took most of the egg off. I hopped back in my truck and was on my way, ready to tackle any other little messes that might pop up during the day. Egg isn't the best for the paint, but the truck is from the 90s and doesn't exactly look mint. I snapped some great pics and even got the CCTV footage from the car wash as evidence. I'm hoping to get some more details soon. There wasn't any major damage, just a bit of annoyance and the cost of a car wash, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. If Mycel did do this, she was smart enough to only throw eggs and not keep my paint or slash my tires, so my insurance wouldn't be involved. I'm feeling optimistic that the police report will lead to some interesting developments. The cops think it was probably just a prank by a teenager, but I'm hopeful. I totally understand that the cops were probably really busy, but it's great that the report will keep a paper trail in case of future incidents. I've been waiting to share this because I was curious to see if anything else would come up. But no, it's right back to the peace and quiet we all love. I'd love to hear any advice on the matter, just in case something like this happens again. The last update, I asked some people on the street about cameras possibly seeing the person who hugged my car. The responses I got were really interesting. Some said they don't have cameras, and others said it was probably just someone pulling a silly prank, especially since it was Halloween. I'm sure it was just a silly prank. The kind folks I chatted with pointed out that I could have asked sooner, and the footage was automatically deleted. So basically, the EGR got away. If it was still, she must have walked around a half-mile in those sweats just to avoid being spotted on camera. I'm sure she questioned if it was even worth the effort, but I'm excited to see what happens. I'm just gonna sit back and see if the egger makes a comeback next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the egger, though, and even stapled a few up on posts. The tenants renting out 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it, and the people in my neighborhood are aware. I don't really blame them. It's not their problem, and I'm excited to see what happens.